Affairs and Defence Minister Richard Marles has completed several days of talks in Washington DC about Australia's AUKUS submarine pact. Towards the end of the trip, he offered assurances that the process is on track to make a decision and to announce when the first nuclear-powered sub will enter the water. Now, Associate Professor at the University of Texas at Austin, Alan J. Kuperman is a semi-regular contributor to Afternoon Briefing. You might have noticed he's back in Canberra with us in the studio today. Great to see you again, Alan, since our last conversation not so long ago. Why don't we pull apart, though, some of the developments happening within the US and the Congress in particular. You're strongly in favour of low enriched uranium models of submarines. America hasn't had one, but where's it up to in developing the technology for one?
Well, what's encouraging is that just in the last few weeks, the U.S. House of Representatives has again authorized and voted to appropriate funding for this low-enriched uranium-fueled submarine. So it's in progress, and what that means is that if Australia were to come to the U.S. and say, hey, look, mate, we really want a nuclear submarine, but we don't want to screw up the non-proliferation regime. So we don't want bomb-grade uranium fuel, we want low-enriched uranium fuel. Can you do that? And the U.S. can say, well, we're working on it, and it might jibe with about when you're supposed to get your sub anyway, so we think we can do it.
But in asking such a question about a project that is still in its development, might Australia risk asking to become something of a technological guinea pig?
Well, I don't think the U.S. is going to give anything to Australia that the U.S. government isn't sure is going to work. But they would be the first U.S.-produced submarine with LEU fuel. If Australia doesn't want to be that kind of guinea pig, I would never use that term, but they can go to France, because France already produces, and for many years has produced, nuclear submarines with LEU fuel. And as I mentioned to you the last time we talked, France could provide an LEU sub before the U.S. could provide an HEU sub. So it might be the best of all worlds for Australian security and non-proliferation.
Conversely, with your knowledge of these things, the long lead times in development, were Australia to wait for it to be fully developed, low-enriched uranium reactor in a US submarine, realistically, at, what is it, $20 million worth of additional funding just recently. How long is it going to take to reach that point?
Well, at that level of funding, it's going to take a very long time. And so there's movement possibly in the U.S. Senate to bump up the funding considerably. We'll have to see. We have a bicameral legislature. But I think that if Australia came to the U.S. and said, we want an LEU submarine under AUKUS, then Biden would get behind it, and all of a sudden you'd see not 20 million a year, but maybe 100 million a year. And then it could be produced probably within 10 years, the feasibility study on the LEU fuel. And as your defense minister said, you're not expecting even the HEU submarines from the U.S. until the mid-2040s, the first one. So I'm not sure that LEU fuel would delay this much, if at all.
So a lot of your analysis, Alan, hinges on, some sort of breach, I suppose, in the AUKUS arrangements of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Who, though, would be custodian of the nuclear fuel and the reactor under this agreement, as you understand it? Would it be Australia and therefore in breach, or would it in fact not be a breach because it remained American at all times?
So it's not clear who's going to take title to this fuel, whether this will be a military-to-military transaction or civilian, whether this will come under IAEA safeguards. All of that is to be determined. But to be clear, even if it's HEU fuel, it's not a breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What it is a breach of the Non-Proliferation Regime, which has said for nearly 50 years that there will be no HEU fuel used in new reactors. The U.S. even denied Germany, one of its closest allies, it denied it fuel for a reactor that has only 8 kilograms of HEU in its core, because it said that violates the non-proliferation regime. And that's on land where you can inspect it, not 20,000 leagues under the sea where you can't inspect it. So it's really the non-proliferation regime that's at risk, and if Australia breaks it by getting HEU-fueled reactors, then many other countries are going to do that, and some of them are going to be doing it just to get HEU for bombs.
Yeah, and I think last time we spoke, it was on the occasion of the IAEA's Director General visiting Australia. Who would be likely to trigger some sort of challenge legally? Who would be bringing this to a head if they thought Australia's actions within AUKUS were not right?
I think the first thing you're going to see is the Non-Proliferation Treaty has a review conference, and that's going to be starting August 1st in New York, coincidentally. And I think what you're going to see is a number of countries from this region are going to be condemning Australia for this plan. Some don't want nuclear submarines at all, and others will say, we don't want bomb-grade uranium because it's undermining the non-proliferation regime. And then Australia is going to have to think about, does it want to have good relations with its neighbors or not? It's talked a lot in the wake of the Solomon Islands thing. We want to build close relationships in the region. Well, the region is very upset about this decision.
And what would be the consequence of some sort of resolution, statement, or expression of diplomatic unease by those?
Well, I don't think Albo's going to jail, if that's what you're asking. I just think that it's going to roil the waters, no pun intended, between Australia and countries that it really wants to have good diplomatic relations with. And in their heart of hearts, I don't think the Labour Party wants to mess up the non-proliferation regime. So I hope they make a virtue out of this necessity and go for low enriched uranium rather than bomb-grade uranium.
Right, and I know you're not in a position to ascertain these things, but you do talk as widely as you can. Is there any reason to believe that the approach taken by the Albanese government might differ, and let's face it, differ substantially from what was begun by the Morrison government?
The only thing two things I know. One, people in the U.S. government say there are now discussions about an LEU-fueled submarine for AUKUS. Not a decision, but discussions. And then recently I've heard that there appear to have been discussions between Australia and France on this very recently. Again, not a decision, but an exploration of that option. And so those are two things that the Morrison government did not do.
All right, well, they might be questions we can take up with the Australian government. Alan Kuperman, great to see you again back in this country. I'm sure we'll talk again before too long.
Thanks, Greg.